They thought she walked in alone. 3 network lawyers upstairs, 2 uniformed cops in the lobby, a studio full of strangers waiting to watch her bleed on camera, and the woman in red. She believed she was the hunter. That's how traps work. Everybody thinks they built it. It was 1972. Harlem wasn't swinging anymore. It was surviving. Sirens didn't pass through the neighborhood, they lived there. Powder moved faster than buses. Kids grew up before they had a chance to be children. And 4 years after they buried Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, folks downtown figured his name was safe to step on. They were wrong. Up on the 10th floor of Lenox Terrace, the curtain stayed half-drawn. Not out of fear, out of discipline. The apartment was quiet in a way that made men uncomfortable. Plastic still wrapped the sofa cushions. The wood furniture shined like it had something to prove. Nothing out of place. Nothing by accident. That's where she stood when the envelope arrived. Heavy paper, gold seal, Midtown arrogance. The letter didn't ask, it summoned a special televised segment. Harlem after the fall. They wanted her perspective, they wanted balance, they wanted truth. Truth is expensive. Television prefers something cheaper. She read it once, then again. No emotion crossed her face. When you've watched federal agents tear apart your living room at 3 in the morning, a talk show invitation doesn't shake your hands. Junebug was in the kitchen fixing a loose cabinet hinge. Old soldier. Slower now, but his eyes still worked. He saw storms before clouds formed. She handed him the letter. He read it, snorted once. "That woman don't want charity stories," he said. "She wants blood." Kitty Carlisle, daytime queen, smile sharp enough to cut glass. She had a habit of inviting people onto her stage and peeling them apart while the audience clapped like trained seals. Politicians, activists, anybody controversial enough to spike ratings. And what spikes ratings faster than a dead king's widow? "They'll corner you," Junebug said. "Lights in your eyes, microphone clipped to your collar. They'll control the edits. You won't be talking to her. You'll be talking to a million strangers waiting for you to slip." She walked to the mantel. There was a photo there. Bumpy in a tuxedo, cigar resting easy between his fingers. Eyes half closed like he already knew the punchline to a joke nobody else understood. "They're already rewriting him," she said quietly, "calling him things he never was." Junebug looked at her. "Let them write." She shook her head once, slow. "History doesn't belong to whoever prints it first. It belongs to whoever can prove it." That's when he understood. This wasn't grief talking. This was strategy. She went to the phone and dialed the number printed in gold. When the producer answered, she didn't raise her voice, didn't hesitate. "This is Mrs. Johnson," she said. "Tell Miss Carlisle I accept." The day of the taping, the heat sat on Manhattan like a loaded gun. Asphalt soft enough to swallow a heel. The limousine waiting downstairs looked out of place in Harlem like it wandered into the wrong territory. Neighbors watched from stoops. Word travels fast where memory lives long. She stepped out wearing emerald silk cut sharp as a blade, pearls at her throat. Hat tilted just enough to remind the world she didn't bow. Not to cameras, not to men. Junebug rode up front quiet. They crossed 96th Street, that invisible border where Harlem ended and corporate America pretended it never existed. At Rockefeller Center, cameras flashed before she even reached the revolving doors. Some recognized her, most didn't, but they felt something. Presence does that. Inside, the air conditioning bit like winter. Young assistants scurried around with clipboards and nervous smiles. They led her through corridors where writers argued over punchlines and ratings charts like generals planning a siege. The green room they gave her was small, beige walls, wilting fruit bowl, coffee already cold, disrespect wrapped in politeness. Junebug muttered something under his breath. She didn't sit back against the couch, kept her spine straight. You don't relax in another person's territory. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Kitty Carlisle walked in like she owned oxygen. Blonde hair sculpted into perfection, red dress loud enough to drown out doubt, smile calibrated for daytime dominance. She extended her hand. "So brave of you to come." Mrs. Johnson looked at the hand, then at the woman attached to it. "I'm not here for bravery," she said calmly. "I'm here for accuracy." The smile flickered just a hairline crack. They spoke about format, about honesty, about addressing rumors for balance. Kitty's tone stayed sweet, but her eyes kept measuring, calculating angles, searching for weakness. There was none to find. 5 minutes, the assistant called from the hallway. Kitty turned at the door. "I hope you're ready," she said softly. "We won't be pulling punches." Mrs. Johnson adjusted one pearl at her throat. "I didn't come to duck." The studio lights roared to life like Judgment Day. 300 audience members, mostly white, mostly curious. They wanted spectacle, they wanted scandal. They wanted to see what kind of woman marries a legend and survives him. The curtain parted. Polite applause, careful, reserved. She walked to the chair on the left. Kitty began smooth, compliments wrapped around insults. "You don't look like a crime boss's widow." Laughter rippled through the crowd. First jab. Mrs. Johnson tilted her head slightly. "And what does that look like?" she asked. Silence. Then a soft murmur. Kitty pivoted, shifted, asked about marriage length, about shadow, about fear versus respect. The questions came coated in sugar. The blade underneath got sharper with each one. Then it happened. Kitty leaned back, folded her legs, and let her voice drop. "There are rumors," she said, eyes gleaming, "that your husband avoided prison not because he was clever, but because he cooperated." The word hung there, cooperated. In Harlem, that word meant something else. The audience stiffened. Kitty pressed harder. "Some say he wasn't a king," she continued. "Some say he was a rat." There it was, out loud, on air. The studio air shifted. Even the camera operators stopped breathing. Mrs. Johnson didn't blink. Inside her purse, her fingers brushed against something cold and flat. Not a weapon, something heavier. Kitty leaned forward. "Did the great Bumpy Johnson protect his people?" she asked softly. "Or did he betray them?" That's when the widow smiled. Small, controlled, like someone who just watched a chess piece move exactly where she needed it. "You really want to talk about betrayal?" she asked. And somewhere above them, behind the glass of the control room, a producer suddenly felt very, very nervous, because he could see it now. The hunter had stepped into the wrong cage. And the door had just locked. Kitty thought she had her cornered. That's the danger of believing your own spotlight. The word still hovered in the air, rat. It echoed off the studio walls, bounced off the cameras, settled into the laps of the audience like something poisonous. Mrs. Johnson adjusted her gloves slowly. No rush. Never rush when the other person just made a mistake. "You really want to talk about betrayal?" she repeated. Kitty's smile tightened. "We're talking about public record." "No," Mrs. Johnson said softly. "We're talking about reputation, and you just gambled yours." A flicker, just a flicker. Kitty felt it. The audience leaned forward. They expected outrage, tears, maybe a dramatic denial. What they got instead was calm, dangerous calm. "You called my husband a rat," Mrs. Johnson continued. "That's a heavy word where I'm from." Kitty shrugged lightly. "It's a question many have asked. And you enjoy asking it." A ripple of discomfort in the front row. Kitty reached beneath her chair and pulled out a slim folder. Manila, dramatic, television ready. "We have sources," she said. "Law enforcement whispers, statements suggesting he may have traded information to stay free." Whispers? Mrs. Johnson looked at the folder like it was a child holding a toy gun. "Whispers don't send men to Alcatraz," she said evenly. "Silence does." The audience murmured. Kitty pivoted again. She was good at that. Years of practice turning discomfort into advantage. "If he was so honorable," Kitty pressed, "why did so many of his rivals disappear?" There it was, violence, drugs, blood. She was building a picture, painting it thick. Mrs. Johnson folded her hands in her lap. "You're confusing survival with cruelty," she said. "When Harlem had no protection, my husband provided some." Protection, Kitty's tone sharpened, or control. The crowd liked that one. A few nods. Kitty felt momentum shift back toward her. "So tell us," she said, leaning closer. "If he was such a protector, why are there sealed federal files connected to his name?" Ah, there it is. Mrs. Johnson's eyes changed. Not wider, not angrier, colder. "You're holding theater," she said calmly. not truth. Kitty's jaw tightened. Are you accusing me of lying on my own program? I'm accusing you of being selective. Silence again. Mrs. Johnson reached into her purse. Instant tension. One security guard shifted in the wings. A producer leaned toward his headset. Kitty froze for half a second. Mrs. Johnson pulled out a photograph. She didn't show it yet, just rested it face down on her knee. You want to discuss sealed files, she said quietly. Let's discuss something sealed. Kitty laughed thin and sharp. What is that, a prop? No, Mrs. Johnson replied. Insurance. That word landed heavier than anything said so far. Kitty's posture stiffened. What exactly are you implying? Mrs. Johnson tilted the photograph slightly, still hidden from the cameras. You've built a career exposing other people's secrets, she said, digging through their pasts, turning pain into applause. That's journalism, Kitty snapped. That's profit, Mrs. Johnson corrected. A few members of the audience shifted in their seats. Kitty felt it now, the room wasn't entirely hers anymore. You think I'm afraid of you? Kitty asked. Mrs. Johnson's voice dropped. I don't think you've considered me at all. The control room was restless, producers whispering, ratings gold unfolding in real time. Kitty pushed forward anyway. Pride makes people reckless. Let us be clear, she said. You're suggesting I have something to hide. Mrs. Johnson finally turned the photograph over, but only enough for Kitty to see. The blood drained from the host's face so fast it was almost visible. On the glossy paper, a grainy alleyway, a younger Kitty. No studio lights. No audience applause, just her, handing a thick envelope to a man whose face every detective in Brooklyn would recognize. Kitty inhaled sharply. Mrs. Johnson lowered the photo before the cameras could catch it. What is that? Kitty whispered, microphones still live. You tell me. The audience couldn't see the image, but they saw Kitty's reaction. That was enough. You're bluffing, Kitty said, but the confidence had cracked. This is some kind of trick. Mrs. Johnson leaned in slightly. My husband believed in preparation, she said. He believed people eventually reveal who they are. Kitty's breathing had changed. Who is Marcus? Mrs. Johnson asked softly. The name hit like a gunshot. Kitty flinched. The audience didn't understand, but they felt it. Don't, Kitty whispered. The microphone caught it. 300 people went silent at once. Mrs. Johnson's voice carried now, steady, unhurried. Marcus worked in this building, she said. Mailroom 22, disappeared 8 years ago. Kitty shook her head faintly. We're not discussing. You accused my husband of betrayal, Mrs. Johnson continued. Let's define the word properly. The control room erupted in panic. A producer shouted, dump it, dump the feed. But they were seconds too late. Marcus didn't run away, Mrs. Johnson said clearly. Kitty's hands gripped the armrests. You paid to make him disappear. Gasps rippled through the studio. The red on air light glowed brighter than ever. Kitty's voice cracked. Cut to commercial. Mrs. Johnson stood slowly. He threatened your reputation, she said. Your marriage, your brand. Security moved closer. Mrs. Johnson finally lifted the photograph high enough for the front rows to glimpse. Whispers exploded. That's you, she said calmly. And that's the man you hired. Turn it off. Kitty screamed. The screen in living rooms across America went black. But inside that studio, chaos had only just begun. Security rushed forward. Junibug stepped from the shadows. He didn't shout, didn't posture. He just stood between them. And when the first guard hesitated just for a second, Mrs. Johnson realized something. The trap hadn't just snapped shut on Kitty. It had locked the entire network inside with her. And there was no telling who would panic first. When the red light died, the room came alive. Not calm, not orderly, alive like something wounded and dangerous. 300 people talking at once, producers screaming into headsets, a stage manager waving his arms like he could push chaos back into a box. Kitty was still in her chair, but she didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked cornered. You cut the feed. She snapped at the control booth. "We're dark." Someone yelled back, "Nationwide." Good, she thought. Bad, Mrs. Johnson knew, because witnesses don't disappear when the cameras do. Security closed in, uncertain now. They'd been ready to escort out a grieving widow. They weren't prepared to handle an accusation that heavy. Junebug stood firm. One step forward, not aggressive, just present. "I'd advise everybody to breathe," he said low. "Nobody needs to make a mistake." Kitty rose abruptly, the crumpled photo clutched in her fist. "She's insane," she shouted. "This is extortion, defamation, call the police." Mrs. Johnson didn't raise her voice. "You want police?" she asked evenly. "Good, let's invite them." Kitty's eyes flickered. There it was again, fear, real fear. "You forged that," Kitty said, but it sounded rehearsed already. "Weak. That's fabricated." Mrs. Johnson stepped closer, close enough that only Kitty could hear her next words. "The negative is safe," she murmured, "and so is the affidavit." Kitty's breath stalled. "What affidavit?" she whispered. "The man you hired," Mrs. Johnson said calmly. "He's serving life. He had time to think, time to talk." That hit harder than the photograph. Kitty staggered back half a step. The room watched. Even the security guards stopped moving. "You're bluffing," Kitty tried again, but her voice betrayed her. Mrs. Johnson tilted her head slightly. "My husband didn't bluff." A producer rushed onto the stage, pale and sweating. "Everyone sit down." He barked at the audience. "This is under control." It was not even close. Somebody in the crowd shouted, "What happened to Marcus?" Wrong question, right room. Kitty spun toward the control booth. "Shut them up." But it was too late. Curiosity spreads faster than lies. Two uniformed officers pushed through backstage doors, called for a disturbance. They took in the scene, cameras off, host shaking, audience buzzing, widow standing steady. One of the officers recognized her. "You don't work Manhattan long without knowing who Bumpy Johnson was." "Ma'am," he said carefully, "what's going on here?" Kitty jumped in first. "She threatened me. She assaulted me on air." Mrs. Johnson folded her hands. "I brought evidence of a crime," she said calmly. "That's not assault." The officer glanced between them. "Evidence of what?" Silence stretched thin. Kitty's knuckles were white around the photograph. Mrs. Johnson met the officer's eyes. "Solicitation," she said. The word dropped like a stone in water. Ripples everywhere. Kitty laughed, too loud, too forced. "This is absurd. She's trying to save her husband's reputation by dragging me into some fantasy." Mrs. Johnson's gaze never shifted. "My husband's reputation doesn't need saving," she said, "but yours does." The officer extended his hand. "May I see that photo, ma'am?" Kitty hesitated. That hesitation said more than the image ever could. Finally, she handed it over. The officer studied it. His jaw tightened. He didn't recognize the alley, but he recognized the man receiving the envelope. Everybody did. He handed the photo back slowly. "This is serious," he said. "It is," Mrs. Johnson agreed. The producer stepped in, voice shaking. "Officer, this is a private network issue." "No," the officer cut in. "This is potentially criminal." Kitty's composure shattered. "You're all insane," she snapped. "You have no proof that money was exchanged for anything illegal." Mrs. Johnson reached into her purse again. Junebug watched the room carefully. She pulled out a folded document. "That's why this exists," she said. Kitty stared at it like it was a live grenade. "You wouldn't dare." Mrs. Johnson looked at her steadily. "I already did." The document wasn't for show. Copies had been delivered that morning, district attorney's office, and one more place, somewhere with ink and a printing press. Kitty understood. "You set this up," she whispered. "You planned this." Mrs. Johnson's expression didn't change. "No," she said quietly, "he did." A tremor ran through Kitty's posture, because that meant something worse. This wasn't a reaction. This was patience. Years of it. The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said to Kitty, "we're going to need you to come downtown for questioning." The audience erupted again, half shocked, half thrilled. Daytime television had turned into something else entirely. Kitty straightened her dress, trying to rebuild control. "You can't do this in front of them," she hissed. The officer didn't answer. He simply gestured toward the exit. As security parted the path, Kitty shot one last look at Mrs. Johnson. "You think this ends me?" She spat. "You think you win?" Mrs. Johnson stepped closer, soft voice, deadly steady. "I didn't come here to win," she said. "I came here to correct." Kitty was escorted off stage. Cameras still dark, audience still buzzing, producers frozen. Junebug leaned slightly toward Mrs. Johnson. "You all right?" he asked. She exhaled slowly for the first time. "For now." But as they walked off the set, one of the network executives made a quiet phone call from the shadows. Not to police, not to lawyers, to someone else. Someone who had more to lose than a television host. And when Mrs. Johnson stepped into the hallway, she felt it. The war wasn't finished. It had just expanded. And somewhere in this city, a man who preferred problems solved permanently had just been told her name. By the time they reached the lobby, the temperature had changed. Not outside, inside. You can feel when money gets scared. Executives in gray suits huddled near the elevators, whispering into phones. Assistants ran messages like it was wartime. Security tightened around doors that had never needed guarding before. The officer who'd taken Kitty upstairs reappeared, expression heavier now. "They're holding her for questioning," he told Mrs. Johnson. "Detectives are on their way." She nodded once. No smile, no victory. Junebug stayed close. "You should leave," the officer added quietly, "before this turns into something else." It already had. They stepped outside into a wall of sound. Somebody leaked it. Reporters flooded the plaza. Cameras lifted like rifles. Microphones shoved forward. "Mrs. Johnson, did you accuse Kitty Carlisle of murder? Is there proof? Was Bumpy an informant?" Always that word. She didn't flinch. "My husband," she said calmly, voice cutting clean through the noise, "was many things. A coward wasn't one of them." Flashbulbs exploded. A black sedan idled at the curb, not the network limo. This one she recognized. Junebug's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That ain't ours," he murmured. The back window rolled down just enough. A man inside, mid-40s, silver tie, eyes like a tax collector. "Mrs. Johnson," he called smoothly, "we should talk." She didn't move closer. "About," she asked, "damage control." There it was, not justice, not truth, damage control. Junebug stepped forward half an inch. "We're not interested," he said. The man in the sedan smiled faintly. "Interest isn't the question," he replied. "Repercussions are." Mrs. Johnson studied him. "Not police, not press, private, expensive, connected. You represent the network?" she asked. "Let's just say I represent people who dislike public surprises." She glanced at Junebug, then back at the man. "My surprise was scheduled," she said evenly. "Your people invited it." His smile thinned. "You humiliated one of ours on live television." She humiliated herself. A beat of silence. The man's tone cooled. "There are powerful families who don't appreciate being dragged into allegations." "Ah, now we're speaking clearly." "You're worried about the man in the photograph," she said. "I'm worried about the ripple," he corrected. "Certain names don't belong in headlines." Junebug felt the tension spike. This wasn't just about Kitty anymore. The man leaned slightly forward. "If this continues," he said quietly, "it won't stay confined to a television scandal." Translation: accidents happen. Mrs. Johnson stepped closer to the car window, close enough that the reporters couldn't hear. "You tell whoever sent you," she said calmly, "that the material has already been distributed." The man's eyes flickered. "To who?" "Enough." A long pause. He measured her, measured the risk, measured the headlines forming as they spoke. "You understand," he said slowly, "that if your late husband were alive, this would be handled differently." Her gaze didn't waver. "If my husband were alive," she replied, "this wouldn't have happened at all." That landed. The man leaned back. The window rolled up. The sedan pulled away without another word. Junebug exhaled through his nose. That wasn't about television, he muttered. No, she agreed. It was. They stepped into their own car and pulled north. As Midtown shrank behind them, the noise faded, but the tension didn't. Junebug turned in his seat. You sent copies already? Yes. Where? She looked out the window at passing buildings. District Attorney. And somewhere else. He waited. She let the silence sit. The Times. Junebug let out a low whistle. That's nuclear. It's insurance. Back in Midtown, inside a closed conference room, 3 executives stared at a phone sitting in the center of a polished table. It rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, someone answered. Yes, the executive said nervously. We're aware. A voice on the other end spoke calmly, too calmly. Fix it, the voice said. How? A pause, however you must. The line went dead. The executive swallowed, because however in certain circles didn't mean lawyers. It meant leverage or pressure or something permanent. By nightfall, the story hit the late editions. Talk show scandal, allegations of conspiracy, photograph under review. Kitty Carlisle questioned by police. Harlem widow drops bombshell. The phones in Mrs. Johnson's apartment didn't stop ringing. Publishers, other shows, reporters begging for comment. She let them ring. Junebug watched the street from the window. You think they'll try something? He asked. They already did, she said. He nodded slowly. You think Kitty talks? She doesn't have to. He looked at her, meaning. The man in that alley, she said quietly. He has his own reasons. Junebug understood. When powerful people feel heat, they shift blame downward, and men serving life sentences don't stay loyal forever. A knock hit the apartment door. 3 sharp raps, not frantic, measured. Junebug reached inside his jacket out of habit. She raised a hand. I'll handle it. She opened the door. 2 detectives stood there, one older, one young enough to still believe paperwork solves everything. Mrs. Johnson, the older one said respectfully, we need a statement. She stepped aside. Come in. As they entered, the younger detective glanced around the apartment. Clean, ordered, disciplined, not what he expected from a crime family. The older detective held up a folder. The affidavit, he said, it's real. Yes. And the original negative. In a secure place. He studied her. Why now? She didn't hesitate, because she said rat. The detective didn't smile, but he understood. Reputation in Harlem wasn't gossip, it was currency, and she just defended it with compound interest. As the detectives took their notes, a call came through to the precinct downtown. Kitty had lawyered up, and she wasn't staying silent. She was naming names, not just the man in the alley, others, producers, fixers, middlemen. The ripple was turning into a wave, and waves don't stop at shorelines. Upstairs in her penthouse, Kitty stared at her reflection in a mirror she no longer recognized. Her attorney leaned close. You need to cooperate carefully, he said. They set me up, she whispered. No, he corrected gently. You walked into it. She clenched her jaw. This won't ruin me. The attorney didn't answer, because outside her building the crowd was already growing, and somewhere across town the man from the sedan was making another call, a shorter one this time. Yes, he said quietly, escalate. Back in Harlem, Mrs. Johnson stood at her window watching the city lights flicker on. Junebug joined her. You think they'll come for you? He asked. She watched a police cruiser glide slowly down the avenue. I think they're deciding how, she said. And somewhere in the dark between Midtown and Harlem, a second black sedan started its engine. No reporters, no flashing cameras, just 2 men inside, waiting for an address. The hallway smelled like hot lights and cold fear. Mrs. Johnson walked between Junebug and 2 uniformed officers, not because she needed protection, but because the building suddenly felt smaller. Behind them, muffled shouting, phones ringing, a career collapsing in real time. Junebug leaned closer. That executive made a call. I know, she said, not legal. I know that too. Outside, night had settled heavy over Manhattan. Black cars lined the curb like patient predators. One engine idled longer than the others. Mrs. Johnson noticed. She noticed everything. Don't look, Junebug murmured. I'm not. The officers paused near the curb. Ma'am, do you need an escort home? She smiled faintly. I've had one for years. They didn't understand, but they nodded and left. Junebug opened the car door. Before she got in, a man stepped out of the idling sedan ahead. Mid-40s, tailored coat. Hands too calm, not a thug. Worse, a messenger. Mrs. Johnson, he said smoothly. A word. Junebug shifted his stance, just slightly blocking her. Send it through an attorney, he replied. The man smiled thinly. This isn't legal. Of course it was. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward anyway. Say it. The man studied her, measuring nerve, looking for cracks. You embarrassed someone important tonight. I corrected someone dishonest. He ignored that. There are men who don't appreciate public spectacles. They prefer resolution. Junebug's jaw tightened. Mrs. Johnson's expression didn't move. I buried my husband, she said quietly. You think I'm afraid of inconvenience? A flicker in the man's eyes. Wrong approach, he adjusted. You've made allegations. Allegations create investigations. Investigations uncover things. There it was, not a threat to her safety. A threat to history, to secrets, to old alliances that survived by staying buried. Mrs. Johnson stepped closer. So let them uncover, she said. I'm tired of graves. The man's calm slipped for half a second. You misunderstand, he said softly. If this spreads beyond Kitty, people you never named will feel exposed. They won't sit for interviews. Junebug's voice was ice. Are you finished? The man looked at Mrs. Johnson one last time. You still have time to contain this. Retract, call it grief, confusion, age. The insult was deliberate. She almost smiled. My age, she said gently, is why I no longer bluff. Silence, traffic rolled past like distant thunder. Finally, the man stepped back. You've chosen noise, he said. No, she corrected. I chose daylight. He got back into the sedan. The car pulled away slowly, not defeated, just recalculating. Junebug opened the door again. That wasn't about Kitty. No, Mrs. Johnson said as she slid into the seat. It never was. As they drove, her phone vibrated. Unknown number, she answered, no greeting, just breathing, then a voice, older, measured, familiar in a way that chilled memory. You should have let sleeping men lie, the voice said. She didn't flinch. I did, she replied, for 20 years. A pause. You think the affidavit protects you? I think truth does. A soft chuckle. Truth, the man said, is negotiable. The line went dead. Junebug glanced at her. Who? She stared out the window at Harlem sliding by, brownstones, memories, ghosts. Someone who was at the funeral, she said. That narrowed it down more than most would realize. Her phone buzzed again. This time a text, a photo, not old. Taken tonight, her walking out of the studio. The message beneath it read. This isn't over, she locked the screen. It's begun, she corrected quietly. Junebug saw it then, not fear, not revenge, resolve. But as they turned onto her street, headlights flashed in the rearview mirror. One car, keeping distance, keeping pace. The war had expanded, and someone out there had just decided Mrs. Johnson was no longer a widow. She was a problem, and problems in this city were often handled the old way. The car behind them didn't try to hide anymore. It stayed 3 lengths back, professional distance. Junebug saw it in the side mirror. Silver Lincoln, 2 inside. Mrs. Johnson didn't turn around. Not police. No. They passed her block. Junebug didn't slow. The Lincoln followed. Good, she thought, let them commit. Junebug took a sudden right, then another. Then a tight loop that only someone who'd grown up on these streets would know how to drive without braking. The Lincoln hesitated once, then corrected. Persistent, Junebug muttered. Mrs. Johnson's voice was calm. Take us to Lenox. He glanced at her. You sure? Yes. Lenox Avenue wasn't just a street, it was memory and territory. Junebug made another sharp turn, then accelerated toward Harlem's brighter stretch. Neon signs, late-night crowds, music leaking from doorways. The Lincoln couldn't close in without being seen now. Too public, too many witnesses. They slowed at a red light. The Lincoln stopped 2 cars back, waiting, testing. Mrs. Johnson reached into her purse again. Junebug stiffened. You brought more. She gave him a look. I brought enough. The light turned green. Junebug didn't go. He waited. The driver behind honked. The Lincoln edged left, trying to reposition. That's when Junebug moved. Hard acceleration, sudden left. Cut through a narrow side street barely wide enough for 2 cars. The Lincoln tried to follow. Bad choice. Delivery truck blocking half the lane, pedestrians crossing, it stalled. Junebug didn't. 2 more turns, then another, then darkness. He killed the headlights for 3 seconds and rolled behind a church lot, then out again onto a parallel street. Silence. No silver Lincoln. They drove another 5 blocks before he exhaled. For now, he said. For now, she echoed. They pulled into her driveway. Lights were already on inside. Junebug froze. You leave them on. No. The front door was closed, but not latched. A thin slice of shadow where there shouldn't be one. Junebug stepped out first, hand inside his coat. Mrs. Johnson followed, no panic, just precision. The door creaked open, living room untouched, furniture as it should be, but on the coffee table. An envelope, centered, intentional. Junebug scanned the room, clear. He nodded once. She stepped forward and picked it up. No postage, no name, inside. A single sheet, typed, "You're digging in the wrong grave," and beneath it, a photograph, new, crisp, not her husband, not Kitty, a different man, younger, standing beside her husband decades ago, a man who had never testified, never been charged, never even rumored, a ghost. Junebug looked at it. Who is that? Mrs. Johnson's fingers tightened slightly on the edge. Her composure shifted for the first time tonight. Not fear, recognition. That, she said quietly, is the reason they're nervous. Junebug studied her. You didn't mention him. No. Why? She held the photograph a moment longer. Because he wasn't supposed to survive. Silence filled the room. Outside, somewhere far off, a car engine rolled slowly past. Not stopping, just watching. Junebug's voice lowered. You think he's alive? Mrs. Johnson looked at the fresh print. The recent ink, the message. I think, she said softly, someone wants me to believe he is. She placed the photograph back in the envelope, carefully, deliberately. They've stopped threatening, she added. Junebug understood. What's that mean? It means they're negotiating. The lights flickered once, just a blink, then steady again, but both of them noticed. Mrs. Johnson walked to the window and parted the curtain slightly. The street looked normal. Too normal. She let the curtain fall. They made a mistake tonight, she said. Junebug raised an eyebrow, following us. No. She turned toward him, eyes steady. They reminded me of something. What's that? She slid the envelope back into her purse. That I'm not the only one who kept records. Junebug's expression shifted. You've got more. She didn't smile. I've got insurance. Outside, the silver Lincoln rolled slowly to the corner again, headlights off, engine humming, waiting. And somewhere inside that car, a man lifted a phone and said 3 quiet words. She did fold. The reply on the other end was colder than the night air. Then escalate. The Lincoln didn't move. It just sat at the corner like a patient thought. Inside the house, Junebug locked the door, then locked it again. Deadbolt. Chain, habit. Mrs. Johnson walked calmly into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands were steady. That bothered him more than shaking would have. Escalate, Junebug muttered. That don't sound like conversation. No, she said, it sounds like pressure. He watched her. You expecting them tonight? She took a slow sip. If they were going to be loud, they'd have done it already. Then what? They'll try quiet. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked. Junebug's head snapped up. They both listened. Another creak, then stillness. Junebug's hand slid back inside his coat. Mrs. Johnson set her glass down carefully. That, she said softly, was not pressure. Junebug moved first. Silent steps, controlled breathing. He reached the base of the stairs and paused. Another sound, a shift of weight, not random, intentional. He climbed slowly, each step measured. Halfway up. A voice from the darkness above. Mr. June. Junebug froze. Only a handful of people still called him that. Mrs. Johnson stepped into view at the bottom of the staircase. "Show yourself," she said. A figure stepped from the hallway shadow. Older, gray at the temples. Not armed, at least not visibly, but confident. Too confident. Junebug's voice was low. "How'd you get in?" "Same way you used to," the man replied calmly. That answer landed heavy. Mrs. Johnson stared up at him. "You shouldn't be here." "No," he agreed, "but neither should you be on television." He descended 2 steps, enough for the light to touch his face fully. Junebug exhaled slowly. "I thought you were dead." "So did everyone." Mrs. Johnson didn't blink. "You let them think that." "Yes." "Why?" The man's eyes softened, not with warmth, but with memory. "Because your husband asked me to." Silence hit the room like a dropped curtain. Junebug's jaw tightened. "Don't." "It's true," the man continued. "The night everything went wrong, he knew there was a leak, knew someone close had sold the schedule." Mrs. Johnson's voice was ice. "Kitty." "Yes." "You're saying he knew?" "He suspected." Junebug looked between them. "You telling me Bumpy planned his own?" "No," the man cut in. "He planned contingency." Mrs. Johnson stepped onto the first stair. "You were the contingency." "Yes." "For what?" "For if Kitty wasn't the only one." That changed the air. Mrs. Johnson absorbed it slowly. "The affidavit," she said. "The man in prison." "Small piece," he replied. "Disposable." Her eyes sharpened. "Who isn't disposable?" The man didn't answer immediately. Outside, the Lincoln's engine cut off. That sound carried through the walls. Junebug heard it. "Company," he murmured. The man upstairs nodded slightly. "They're nervous now." "You sent them?" Junebug asked. "No." "Then who?" The man's gaze shifted to Mrs. Johnson. "Board members." That word didn't belong to the street. It belonged to money, power, infrastructure. Mrs. Johnson felt something settle into place. This was never about one woman on television. No. It was about who she protected. "Yes." Junebug exhaled through his nose. "Corporate." "Political," the man corrected. Mrs. Johnson's voice dropped lower. "My husband wasn't political. He was leverage." The truth of that hung heavier than any threat tonight. A car door shut outside. Footsteps on pavement. Mrs. Johnson didn't look toward the window. "You shouldn't have come here," she said again. "I had to see if you understood what you started." "I understand perfectly." "Do you?" His tone sharpened slightly. "Because the men outside aren't here to scare you. They're here to retrieve something." Junebug's eyes narrowed. "Retrieve what?" The man's gaze moved to Mrs. Johnson's purse. "The rest of the record." Junebug looked at her. "You told me insurance." She met his eyes. "It is." The man upstairs shook his head faintly. "It's evidence of systemic bribery, judges, contractors, campaigns. If that surfaces, it doesn't just embarrass a hostess." Mrs. Johnson's voice was calm. "It corrects." A knock hit the front door. Not loud, not aggressive, measured. 3 knocks, pause, 2 more. Junebug didn't move. The man upstairs stepped down 1 more stair. "They'll ask politely first." "And if I refuse?" Mrs. Johnson asked. "They won't escalate publicly." "Privately?" A look passed between the 2 men. That was answer enough. Another knock. Slightly firmer. Mrs. Johnson turned fully toward the door now. No more graves, she murmured. Junebug stepped beside her. You opened that door. Yes. He searched her face. You sure? She gave the faintest nod. I've been ready for 20 years. The third knock came, and this time, a voice followed. Mrs. Johnson, it called calmly from the other side. We just want to talk. She reached for the handle. Upstairs, the man who was supposed to be dead closed his eyes briefly. Outside, shadows shifted on the porch. Inside, history inhaled, and Mrs. Johnson opened the door. The door opened only halfway, chain still on, control still hers. Two men stood on the porch, not street, not cops, tailored coats, polished shoes, faces trained into professional neutrality. The silver Lincoln idled at the curb again, headlights still off. Mrs. Johnson, the taller one said smoothly, we appreciate you taking a moment. You already took one, she replied evenly. His eyes flicked to the chain on the door, a faint smile. We're not here for theatrics. Junebug stood just behind her shoulder. You're here for something, he said. The shorter man finally spoke. A misunderstanding. Mrs. Johnson's gaze didn't shift. No, a history. Silence. The taller man adjusted slightly. You have documents that don't belong in circulation. They belong exactly where they are. A pause, which is. She held his eyes, safe. Upstairs, the floorboard creaked deliberately, a reminder. The taller man noticed it. He recalculated. This doesn't need to widen, he said. The television incident was unfortunate. Emotions were high. 20 years of emotion, she replied softly. The shorter man's tone cooled. You've made your point. No, she corrected, I've begun. A car passed slowly down the block, not stopping, watching. The taller man's jaw tightened slightly. You're threatening structures you don't fully understand. Mrs. Johnson almost smiled. I was married to one. Junebug's presence felt heavier beside her now, grounded, ready. The shorter man shifted tactics. Let S be plain, he said. Your husband's legacy survives because certain files remain buried. Those files protected him from narratives less flattering than martyrdom. There it was, the real blade. Mrs. Johnson's eyes hardened. You think I don't know every flaw that man carried? You know some. Enough. The taller man stepped closer, still outside, still careful. If these records surface, you won't control the story. I'm not trying to. You'll lose sympathy. She inhaled slowly. I lost sympathy the day I buried him. Silence. The men exchanged a brief look. The taller one tried again. What do you want? Finally, a real question. Mrs. Johnson answered without hesitation. Accountability. The shorter man's voice sharpened. That's not how this works. It is now. Behind her, upstairs, the man who was supposed to be dead descended one more step. He spoke clearly enough for the porch to hear. She means it. The two men outside froze. Recognition flickered. The taller man's composure cracked for the first time. You, he breathed. Yes, came the calm reply from inside. Me. The shorter man stepped back instinctively. That's impossible. No, he said. It was inconvenient. The air changed. The porch was no longer a negotiation space. It was a revelation site. Mrs. Johnson didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the men outside. You asked what I want, she said quietly. Now I'll clarify. The taller man swallowed. You have leverage, he admitted carefully. Yes. But so do we. She nodded once. I assumed that. The silver Lincoln's engine revved softly. Impatience, orders waiting. Mrs. Johnson's voice lowered. If anything happens to me, she said, or anyone in this house, every copy goes public. The shorter man frowned. Copies. She let that word sit. Junebug added, plural. Upstairs, the man spoke again. You should leave. The taller man studied Mrs. Johnson one long moment. You've escalated beyond television. No, she corrected, you did. A beat of silence, then he nodded once. This isn't finished. I didn't expect it to be. The two men stepped off the porch, walked calmly back to the Lincoln, doors shut. Engine rose, the car rolled away slowly, not defeated, not victorious, repositioning. Mrs. Johnson closed the door gently, locked it, chain secured. Silence settled inside the house. Junebug exhaled hard. That was board level. Yes. He looked toward the staircase. You being alive just changed the equation. The man descended fully now, standing in the living room light. It complicates it. Mrs. Johnson turned to face him at last. You weren't supposed to come back into this. I didn't, he replied. You pulled me. She held his gaze. No, she said softly, they did. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a phone rang inside a moving car. A calm voice answered. She's fortified. A colder voice responded, then fracture her. Inside the house, Mrs. Johnson walked to the fireplace, reached behind the mantel, pulled loose a small panel Junebug had never noticed. Inside, a metal lockbox. She set it on the table, opened it, not papers, not photographs, a recorder, old-fashioned, analog. She looked at the man who wasn't supposed to be alive. You told me to keep it, she said. He nodded slowly. Junebug stared between them. Keep what? Mrs. Johnson pressed play. Static. Then a voice from decades ago. Her husband's calm, measured, naming names, real ones. The room went still. Upstairs windows reflected streetlights like watching eyes, and as the recording continued, one thing became clear. This war wasn't about clearing his name. It was about detonating the truth he'd left behind. And someone powerful had just realized the fuse was already lit. The tape hissed. Old magnetic ribbon carrying newer danger. Her husband's voice filled the living room, calm, deliberate, unmistakable. If anything happens to me, this is because the committee refused the revised terms. Names follow. Junebug didn't move. The man who wasn't supposed to be alive closed his eyes briefly. Mrs. Johnson let it play. One name, another. A developer, a campaign treasurer. The kind of list that didn't make headlines, it made governments nervous. She pressed stop. Silence roared. Junebug exhaled slowly. That's not leverage. No, she said, that's detonation. The man across from her nodded once. He recorded that the night before the meet. The alley, Junebug muttered, yes. Mrs. Johnson studied the recorder. He knew. He suspected, the man corrected gently. He didn't know how deep it ran, just that Kitty was a door, not the house. Junebug paced once across the room. So what's the play? Drop it to press. DA, federal. Mrs. Johnson shook her head. Not yet. The man looked at her carefully. You waited 20 years. Why move now? She met his eyes. Because they panicked. What? Outside, tires rolled slowly past again, not stopping, circling. Junebug glanced toward the window. They're mapping patterns. Let them, she said calmly. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number again. She didn't hesitate this time, answered on speaker. A different voice, female, controlled. You've complicated things, the woman said. Mrs. Johnson didn't ask who it was. Good. A pause. You think you're protected because you distributed copies. I am protected because you don't know how many. Silence on the line, then. What do you want? Public acknowledgement. Of what? That my husband didn't die over street money. The woman's tone sharpened. You release that recording and you don't just burn politicians. You destabilize contracts tied to pension funds, infrastructure, people uninvolved. Mrs. Johnson's expression didn't change. They were involved when they benefited. Junebug watched her carefully. The woman tried another angle. You'll fracture your own husband's legacy. He made compromises. Mrs. Johnson's voice lowered. I married him, not a myth. A breath on the other end. You're not naive, the woman said. You know how this ends. Yes, Mrs. Johnson replied. How? With sunlight. The call disconnected. Junebug shook his head slowly. They're scared. Yes. The man near the staircase folded his arms. That was high enough to matter. Mrs. Johnson nodded once. Board level wasn't the ceiling. Upstairs, a radiator clicked loudly in the quiet. Junebug stopped pacing. All right, he said. We assume surveillance. We assume pressure. We assume they'll try to isolate you. They already tried, she said. He looked at her. She lifted the envelope from earlier and removed the recent photograph, the ghost from decades ago. You weren't supposed to survive, she had said. Now she looked at the man standing in her living room. They don't know what to do with you. He gave a faint smile. They never did. Junebug frowned. You staying? The man hesitated. That depends. On what? On whether she intends to finish this. Mrs. Johnson didn't hesitate. Yes. No drama, no anger, just finality. The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Then you don't release the tape. Junebug blinked. What? You don't detonate first, the man continued. You force them to expose themselves trying to stop you. Mrs. Johnson's eyes sharpened slightly. Pressure creates mistakes. Yes. Junebug leaned against the wall. So we bait them. The man nodded. You've already made noise. Now you go quiet. Mrs. Johnson understood immediately. They'll escalate privately. And when they do, he said, you document. Junebug gave a low whistle. Turn hunters into evidence. The man looked at him. Exactly. Outside, the silver Lincoln returned again, slower this time, confident. A second vehicle followed, black SUV, more deliberate. Junebug saw the reflection in the window. We're outnumbered. Mrs. Johnson moved toward the fireplace again, reached behind a framed photograph, removed a small key, opened a drawer beneath the bookshelf. Inside, a slim digital device, modern, encrypted. Junebug stared. You said analog was the insurance. She met his eyes. That was the memory. She held up the device. This is the trigger. The man who wasn't supposed to be alive looked genuinely surprised. You digitized it. Years ago. How many copies? She didn't answer. Headlights washed briefly across the curtains. Engines cut off outside. Car doors opened, more than two. Junebug straightened. They're not knocking this time. Mrs. Johnson placed the digital device on the table between them. Calm, centered. They think escalation scares me. The man stepped closer. It does. No, she agreed softly. It accelerates me. A firm knock hit the door. Not polite, not measured, authority without badges. Junebug's hand slipped inside his coat again. The man exhaled once. Mrs. Johnson picked up the device. Another knock, louder, a voice from outside. Mrs. Johnson, we need to resolve this tonight. She walked toward the door. Junebug blocked her gently. Last chance to step back. She looked at him. I stepped back for 20 years. The knocking stopped. Silence again, heavy, waiting. Mrs. Johnson reached for the handle, but this time. She smiled, because now she understood something they didn't. They weren't here to silence her. They were here because they didn't know where the real danger was, and that meant. For the first time since the red studio light went dark. She had control. The knocking stopped. That was the tell. When men like that stopped knocking, it meant they were listening, measuring, waiting for movement inside. Mrs. Johnson didn't open the door. She stepped back instead. Junebug noticed immediately. You changed your mind. No, she said calmly. I changed the frame. Outside, a shadow passed across the frosted glass. Another voice joined the first, lower, impatient. We know you're in there. Mrs. Johnson raised her voice just enough to carry. I would hope so. It's my house. Silence again. They hadn't expected engagement. Junebug moved toward the side window, barely shifting the curtain. 4, he murmured. 2 on porch, 2 near the SUV. The man who wasn't supposed to be alive stepped closer to the table. They won't breach, he said quietly. You sure? Junebug asked. Yes. Why? Because if she's telling the truth about distribution, any visible force triggers release. Mrs. Johnson didn't confirm. She didn't need to. Another knock. Harder. Mrs. Johnson, the porch voice called, dropping civility. We are trying to prevent consequences. She walked toward the door but stopped a few feet short. Consequences, she repeated. For who? For everyone. There it is, she said softly to the room. Junebug frowned. What? They're afraid of collateral. The man nodded once, which means the board isn't unified. Mrs. Johnson's eyes sharpened. Exactly. She raised her voice again. If you're here without badges, she called out, then you're here unofficially. A pause. That's correct, the voice admitted. Then you have no authority. Another pause. We have influence. She smiled faintly. That's different. Inside, Junebug felt the balance shift. Outside, someone shifted their weight on the porch, a subtle scuff of expensive leather. Mrs. Johnson took one more step toward the door, still closed, still locked. You want resolution, she called calmly. Bring me one signature. Silence. The men outside hadn't expected negotiation. One signature from who? The porch voice asked. She didn't hesitate. The chairman. That word landed, inside and out. Junebug's eyebrows lifted slightly. The man behind her watched her with new respect. Outside, low murmuring between the men. The porch voice returned, tighter now. That's unrealistic. No, she said, that's accountability. You're overestimating your leverage. She glanced at the digital device in her hand. No, she replied, you are. A car drove slowly down the block. Didn't stop, but headlights lingered a fraction too long. Junebug noticed. So did she. The porch voice lowered. You release anything, markets react before investigations. You damage innocent people. Innocent people, she repeated. You know that's true. She did. That was the only blade sharp enough to matter. The man behind her spoke quietly so only those inside could hear. They're splitting. Listen to tone. He was right. One of the men outside said something sharper, agitated. The other responded with restraint, not unified, not coordinated. Mrs. Johnson made her decision. I'm not releasing tonight, she said clearly through the door. A pause, but I am scheduling. For what? The voice demanded. A press conference. Junebug blinked slightly. The man behind her did. Outside, a beat of silence then. You do that and there's no going back. She answered without raising her voice. I wasn't planning to. A long stretch of quiet. Wind moved faintly through the trees. Then the porch voice shifted tone entirely. No more pressure, just calculation. What do you need? There it was again, the real question. Mrs. Johnson glanced at Junebug, at the man who survived the past, then back at the door. Public reopening of the investigation, she said, with independent oversight. That implicates people still in office. Yes. That destabilizes. Yes. The voice exhaled slowly. That's not a small request. Neither was murder. Silence, longer this time. Junebug could almost feel the weight of phone messages being drafted inside that SUV. Decisions climbing ladders in real time, finally. We can't promise that, the porch voice said carefully, but we can discuss structured review. No, she replied instantly, open review. Another pause, you're forcing hands. Yes. A final murmur outside, then footsteps retreating off the porch, car doors closing, engines starting. The SUV pulled away first. The Lincoln lingered 3 seconds longer, then followed. Junebug waited until the sound faded completely, then 5 seconds more. Only then did he exhale fully. They backed off. For tonight, the man corrected. Mrs. Johnson finally locked the final deadbolt again. This time she leaned against the door for just a moment, not from weakness, from awareness. Junebug stepped closer. You just declared war on a boardroom." What? She looked up at him. "No," she said quietly. "I forced them into daylight." The man across the room studied her. "You understand what happens if they refuse?" "Yes. And if they accept?" She thought about that. "Then the truth doesn't belong to me anymore." Silence settled. Upstairs, the house creaked gently, old wood adjusting to new tension. Her phone vibrated again. A text, unknown number, 3 words. Junebug read it over her shoulder. "That fast." "They don't want press." The man gave a faint nod. "They'll try to negotiate terms before exposure." Mrs. Johnson turned the phone face down on the table. "Good." Junebug studied her carefully. "You all right?" She looked toward the darkened window, toward the street that had watched her all night. "For the first time in years," she said softly, "they're reacting to me." Outside, somewhere in the city, phones were ringing in quiet offices. Names were being rechecked, files reconsidered, all because a widow refused to stay one. And as the night settled back into deceptive calm, one thing became clear. The next move wouldn't be made in shadows. It would be made across a table, in daylight, where reputations were harder to bury and far more dangerous to exhume. Morning came clean, no circling cars, no shadows on the porch, just sunlight cutting across polished wood and old scars. Mrs. Johnson didn't bring Junebug. She didn't bring the man who wasn't supposed to be alive. She brought a folder and the device. The building wasn't labeled with a name. It didn't need one. Upper floors. Private elevators, quiet carpets that swallowed footsteps. She was escorted into a conference room wrapped in glass and skyline. 5 people at the table. 3 she recognized from photographs. 2 she did not. No assistants, no lawyers. That told her everything. The chairman sat at the head, silver hair, controlled eyes. "Mrs. Johnson," he said evenly, "you've made quite an impact." She took the empty chair opposite him. "I intend to." No one smiled. A man to the chairman's right folded his hands. "You understand the implications of what you're alleging?" "I understand them better than you do," she replied. The chairman leaned forward slightly. "You have a recording?" "Yes." "You have documents?" "Yes." "And you've distributed copies?" She didn't answer that one. He studied her. "Why now?" The question wasn't hostile, it was curious. She opened the folder. Inside were photographs, ledger pages, copies of contracts with annotations. Then she placed the digital recorder in the center of the table. She didn't press play, not yet. "My husband was useful to you," she said calmly, "until he was." No one interrupted. "You let the narrative say it was street rivalry." Silence. "You let his name shrink." The man on the left shifted slightly. The chairman's voice stayed measured. "He made choices." "Yes," she said, "and so did you." She pressed play, static. Then his voice filled the glass room. Calm, specific, naming contributions, percentages, dates, not emotional, transactional. One of the unidentified men stiffened. The woman at the far end went pale. The chairman didn't move at all. When she stopped the recording, the room felt smaller. "You release that," the chairman said carefully, "and investigations begin immediately." "Yes." "Markets react." "Yes." "People resign." "Yes." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And you're prepared for that?" She met his gaze evenly. "I buried my husband because of it. You can survive headlines." A long pause, then, unexpectedly, the woman at the far end spoke. "She's right." 4 heads turned. The woman inhaled slowly. "We thought containing it protected stability. It protected liability." The man beside her snapped. "You can't be serious." She didn't look at him. "If this leaks outside our control, it's worse." The chairman studied her. "You're suggesting what?" She turned to Mrs. Johnson. "Independent reopening, public, controlled transparency." Mrs. Johnson held her eyes. "Not controlled." The woman nodded once. "Transparent." Silence fell again. The board was no longer unified, and they all knew it. The chairman leaned back. For the first time, he looked tired. "You understand," he said to Mrs. Johnson, "this won't restore him." "I'm not restoring him," she replied. "I'm correcting you." Another long silence. Then the chairman gave a small nod. "To reopen formally requires a vote." "Then vote." He looked around the table, one by one. Hands rose, not unanimous, but enough. The chairman exhaled slowly. "It will be announced by end of week." Mrs. Johnson didn't smile. "Today." He studied her. "Today," he amended. By noon, news alerts rolled across every network. Investigation reopened. Board authorizes independent oversight. Historic case under review. Commentators speculated. Politicians distanced themselves. Markets dipped. But they did not collapse because the recording had not been released, only acknowledged. Back in Harlem, Junebug watched the television in silence. The man who wasn't supposed to be alive stood beside him. "She did it," Junebug murmured. "No," the man replied quietly. "She forced them to." Mrs. Johnson returned home before sunset. No cars followed. No shadows lingered. The house felt like wood and air again. Junebug met her at the door. "Well, it's open," she said simply. The man stepped forward from the staircase. "You didn't release it." "No." "Why?" She looked at the device in her hand. "Because truth isn't always a bomb." She walked to the fireplace, opened the lockbox, placed the recorder inside, closed it. "Sometimes," she added softly, "it's leverage." The man nodded slowly. "Will you ever release it?" She met his eyes. "If they lie." That answer was enough. Weeks passed, names surfaced, resignations followed. Kitty disappeared from screens. Contracts were reviewed, statements revised. The narrative shifted, not perfectly, not cleanly, but permanently. One evening, Mrs. Johnson stood alone at her husband's grave. The city hummed quietly in the distance. She didn't cry, she didn't speak long. "They said you were leverage," she murmured. A faint breeze moved through the trees. "I made you accountability." She stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Not a widow, not a weapon, not a victim, just a woman who refused to let powerful men decide where the story ended. And somewhere in a glass tower downtown, a chairman signed a document he never thought he would. Because one red studio light had gone dark, and a quieter light had come on.